I'm Richard Herman. I co-direct Mershon's research cluster on American foreign and military policy. The focus of our cluster the past 2 years has been US relations with NATO allies and NATO's relations with Russia. This included exploring the broader constellation of interests and perceptions of threat and that occurred when NATO expanded from 12 to 30, as well as the up and down relationships between the United States and important NATO allies like Germany, France, and Italy, running from the tense days of the Iraq War through the Obama years when some Europeans questioned the priority the president put on Europe, to the somewhat rancorous recent Trump administration. Driving much of my work was tracking the diverse views of how to deal with Russia that were evident in NATO. Our plan for some time has been to hold a conference this spring, bringing distinguished scholars from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and both the United States and Russia together to discuss the future of security in Europe and the role NATO might play in that. That conference is still set to convene on April 8th and will be available via Zoom. You can find further details about it at Mershon Center at osu.edu. Clearly, the trends of the past few months, and especially the dramatic tragedy unfolding in Ukraine across the past 7 days, has already done a great deal to change attitudes and foreign policies across Europe. They are almost certain to become seen in hindsight as a critical turning point. Scholars will be writing about this for a long time to come. Like all wars, this Russian invasion of Ukraine will provoke continuing debate about its causes, how it was prosecuted, and its consequences. It's a large phenomenon. And as we see in the current media coverage, it's comprised of thousands of individual stories of heroism and tragedy and all sorts of political, social, and economic dimensions. There are already plenty of speculations on the implications for global geopolitical relations in Asia and the Middle East. The conflict has been framed as an ideological showdown between democracy and autocracy. While Vladimir Putin has made Ukraine the battleground, he left little doubt in his speeches of February 22nd and 24th that the enemy is the United States. This Friday from noon to 1:30, I'll co-host an open forum for Mershon to discuss this and other aspects of the conflict. At that time, my co-host will be Dr. Scott Smitson. After a 21-year career in the US Army, Dr. Smitson is now professor of geostrategy at the United States Special Operations Command and Joint Special Operations University. During his career, Scott was a strategic advisor to General Lloyd Austin, then commander of Central Command, and now Secretary of Defense. Scott participated in the creation of the campaign plan for Russia and China. He's currently advising on the creation of the forthcoming 2022 National Defense Strategy. On March 24th, I'll host Professor Timothy Fry, the former director of the Harriman Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Columbia University. He's also, of course, a former colleague of ours here at Ohio State. He recently is the author of Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia, published last year by Princeton University Press. At that time, we will develop deeply into Vladimir Putin, his beliefs and his strengths and vulnerabilities. Of course, in all this geostrategic talk, it is possible to lose sight of the human side of this conflict and the concrete realities of Ukraine. These are not all that familiar to Americans and have been part of the ongoing information war from at least 2014. They are now likely to be defined by many in America from the lens of the geopolitical global contest rather than from the ground up, rooted in a rich picture of the history, actors, and dynamics in contemporary Ukraine. Today, I'm very glad that we have with us Dr. Gerard Toal, who can help us immeasurably in this regard. Across my research these past few years, I read a great deal on the conflicts in Ukraine and Georgia and found Professor Toal's book, Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest over Ukraine and the Caucasus, published by Oxford University Press, the best there is. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. In 2019, it won a Distinguished Book Award from the International Studies Association. I heard Dr. Toal last week in an event organized by the Kennan Institute in Washington, describing a new project he's involved with that was in the field collecting data on popular beliefs and preferences in both government-controlled parts of Ukraine and the non-government controlled parts as recently as January of this year. Dr. Toal is a professor of government and international affairs in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech University. I'm very grateful he accepted my invitation to help us understand the crisis in Ukraine. And I now turn the room over to him. Welcome, Gerard.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Ohio State for this opportunity to speak on what is a very unsettling and difficult crisis to address. I think that we need to begin with acknowledging and expressing solidarity with those that are under attack right now in Ukraine, acknowledging the absolute horrific nature of what is occurring that is shocking even long-term analysts of the particular crisis. I would hope that also our empathy can also extend beyond simply those under fire to also include those that are victims, including some Russians that are not part of the regime, many Russians that are not part of the regime, and even some of the raw recruits that we see who are confused about why they are in Ukraine. I know that's a difficult thing for some to kind of stretch to also have some empathy for them, but this is a tragedy of the highest order, and I think that we need compassion all around as it unfolds. I would also want to say that what I'm trying to do here is to provide a degree of I don't want to say objectivity, because it's not possible to have a kind of a distant objectivity on what we're seeing right now, but to have some analytical clarity and to make a set of arguments that I think are important and worth discussing and worth debating, so that we are not simply just ruled by our emotions, important that those are in this particular moment. I should also point out that I am not a Ukrainian. I'm Irish, as you can probably tell from my accent, and I would not describe myself as a specialist in Ukraine. I am a political geographer who has, over my 30-year career, specialized in really post-communist territorial conflicts and the ways in which they have interlinked with geopolitical competition and struggle across the world. So with that, let me just also acknowledge the fact that I work as part of a team, and that part of that team and a part of the research involves Ukrainians and Russians doing work, survey work for us. And so that informs what I want to share with you here. I want to begin by a series of contentions. Political geographers think in somewhat different ways from folks in international relations and those that study geostrategy. But one of the concepts that we try to think about and use is the idea of a geopolitical field. And I think the first point to make in order to situate what is unfolding right now is that we're dealing with a landscape which is a fragmented post-imperial political geographic landscape amidst geoeconomic interdependence. And this is a particular diagram from my book, Near Abroad, which features a metropolitan state, which is a former imperial center, and then a nationalizing state, which was previously part of an imperial structure, previously part of an empire, which is seeking to separate itself from the empire to establish a nation state, which is separate from the empire. But within that, you have regions that are secessionist and would have loyalty, residual loyalty to the empire, and would fear the implications of the nationalizing state, particularly for their status and for their power. And so, and then within the metropolitan state, you may have a region which is itself secessionist that the metropolitan state has had to deal with. So you think of, and I've written a book on Bosnia. This is in part the landscape of Bosnia, of Yugoslavia, where you have Serbia and the nationalizing state being Bosnia, the secessionist regions being Republika Srpska. It's also my own home country. It is the British Empire, and Ireland as the nationalizing state, and Ulster as the secessionist region. What is really important here in this context is the external normative power, the Euro-Atlantic organizations and institutions that are seeking to help the nationalizing state to stand up on its own and to exercise proper sovereignty over its territory. And then the competition that develops between this external normative power and the metropolitan state or the former imperial power. Now, that in one sense is a vision of space which features blocks and territorial blocks. That is somewhat misleading. So we have to also talk about the fact that there's interdependence here. There's massive sets of flows. So when we're thinking about political geography, we can't just simply think in terms of territorial blocks and containers. We also have to think of connections, flows, of finance, of trade, and of course, really, really significantly, oil and gas in this particular context. So that's the first kind of contextualization that I would begin with. And then I want to begin with the first theory of the particular crisis. And I want to make the argument, which is that the war in Ukraine is a planned punitive war by Vladimir Putin. This is Putin's war. I think it is a major strategic blunder on his part. It's the riskiest thing he has ever done. It imperils his particular regime. And the implications of that are going to unfold right now. But I also want to say that the crisis is a product of long-standing competition between Euro-Atlantic structures and the decisions of Ukrainian actors, crucial decisions of Ukrainian actors. So there is important Ukrainian agency here, and also the actions of Russia over the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine. And this leads me to an argument, which is that this crisis was not inevitable. This crisis was not built in. This crisis was not a sort of unfolding of a particular essence. It was avoidable. There are a series of different crises or theories of the crisis. There are largely structural ones, and the dominant one in our culture is probably the hawkish ideological one, which talks about Russia and its imperial DNA, and that this is, as Richard mentioned, a showdown with autocracy, and that there was a sort of inevitable unfolding logic to this, democracy versus autocracy. I disagree with that particular theory, and I will explain why. Now, there are also structural realist arguments which talk about power transitions, and this is, in one sense, predictable because it is a weak state, great power that was weak, that is recovering, and therefore there's a power transition, and with that power transition, you have increasing likelihood of war. That's a sort of one kind of form of structural realism, which is more of a sort of offensive realism. The second form is a structural realist argument, which sees it as an encroachment crisis. States seek to control the security environment in their neighborhood, and therefore this is what Russia is doing. And so there's a certain logic to this. And further, you will know this from John Mersheimer's work, Stephen Walt's argument, is that there's a certain liberal imperialism at work here, in that the West is kind of constantly seeking to expand and therefore has no tolerance for autocracy. It's constantly seeking to undermine the other, which is autocracy. So therefore it is promoting, quote unquote, colored revolutions. And there is in one sense a vision that Russia's vision of colored revolution is a sort of their domino theory. Those arguments, I think, have problems. And I think I would argue for the second set of theories of the crisis. This is co-created, and it emphasizes instead this eventful road to NATO expansion, the radicalization, and the importance of the radicalization of certain events. So this particular theory emphasizes critical junctures, paths taken one way rather than another, and as a consequence, we have the particular crisis that we have. I can talk about that in greater detail later on, but I want to get through a lot. There's other theories which really emphasize Putin and see this as a very personalistic one. I think those theories do not take into consideration the fact that Putin, in one sense, is representing a very important, not necessarily the kind of determined to be or destined to be the dominant tradition within Russian geopolitical culture, but certainly a very important one amongst security analysts and bureaucrats there, which is that Russia needs to control its buffer lands because of its historical experience with invasion. And then there's a fourth theory which talks about it in terms of opportunistic notions. There's a whole important history here. I'm not going to go through it all with you, but I do want to talk about two things which are really, really vital. The first is the Orange Revolution of 2004, in which a Russian-backed leader, Yushchenko, Yanukovych was essentially put in, cheated, and was declared the president of Ukraine only for popular protests, the Orange Revolution in Maidan Square in Kiev, to challenge that. And then there was a rerun of the election, and his challenger, the Western-orientated Yushchenko, won that election in a much more transparent set of elections. This is important because it was read as a Western conspiracy in Moscow, and this is a theme which we're going to see again and again. It need not have been inevitably read that way, but it was by the leadership of Russia, and that had major consequences in terms of how things unfolded. But the implications of that were things that really did not have to necessarily blossom in the way that they did. I then want to talk about Ukraine 2014 and what happened there. We have a particular dominant conception in our culture about the Maidan. And on the Maidan, the West saw a people's revolution. It saw a people coming out and making a civilizational choice for Europe and rejecting the particular option of, instead of refusing the European Association Agreement, choosing an agreement and an orientation with the Eurasian Economic Union. The Maidan is a very, very important event. What I want to argue is that it is complex. It's a complicated event, and it has a number of different phases, the last phase of which was, of course, extremely violent. But the Russian leadership saw this as Western instigated, a Western coup. Now, I need to be very explicit here. It was not that. Nevertheless, it was read that way. That was an important kind of particular geopolitical conjuncture, a particular moment in which an event is read by the Russian security establishment in a particular way. And of course, Victoria Nuland giving out sandwiches and cookies on the Maidan became a trope, a visualization of this coup narrative. Again, a false narrative, but one that we should nevertheless, in rejecting that, nevertheless look at the ways in which there are ambivalences within that particular crucial juncture. What this then, of course, led to is the seizure of Crimea and the effort, really very, very, very ad hoc effort by imperial nationalists from Russia to go into southeastern Ukraine and to try to create a Novorossiya. And I kind of described that particular process in my book. That particular project failed. Novorossiya did not have any sense of kind of popular legitimacy. There were some that supported it, but it was very, very few. But in the Donbas, the sort of local regional identity, the Soviet identity, the sense of separateness, which was based upon genuine economic fears about what joining the European Union would mean, in other words, rejecting the Eurasian Economic Union, what that would mean for their future. The implications of that led people to a protest against Maidan. That was essentially captured and bottled by these imperial nationalists who came in from Russia and kind of converted into what became instruments of Russian foreign policy, which were these two people's republics set up in Luhansk and in Donetsk in the major urban areas. And so what you were left with was this ugly geography of territorial control of part of Ukraine by Russian-backed separatists. Now, the Russian army and its intervention in 2014 were absolutely central in creating these. I think these particular entities are very different, distinctive from what you got in Abkhazia, Transnistria, South Ossetia. And so that's worth underscoring. They're also extremely large relative to those other post-Soviet de facto states. So I then want to talk a little bit about the geopolitical field in Ukraine after 2014. And the way to look at it is as a stack of interlocked conflicts. So this particular diagram gets at this, and it's got a number of different dimensions to it. We have 6 different dimensions here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these dimensions. We can come back to other dimensions, but I want to talk about the territorial conflict in the Donbas, first of all, and a little bit on the nationalizing identity conflict within Ukraine, and then the geostrategic conflict. And here what I want to do is talk to you about some of the research my colleagues and I have done. So we have, for quite a number of years, got money from the National Science Foundation to do research on attitudes in de facto states. These are difficult areas to do research in. And of course, doing research in COVID times is especially difficult. But we, together with ZOAS, a German research institute, got funding to do a series of surveys in the Donbas on both sides of the line. So in other words, the government-controlled parts of the Donbas, but also the occupied parts of the Donbas, so the non-government controlled parts of the Donbas, the parts controlled by these states set up and supported by Russia. We asked the exact same questionnaire in all of these locations. And what we did is we had, since we suspected this is the 3rd wave of surveys we did there. We suspected that you can only sort of do surveying through telephone surveys here. And we suspected that the particular location of the surveying company, the sort of area code that someone would immediately identify when a phone is coming in, might shape the results. So what we did is we actually had 3 different companies do this research and ask questions. Long story short, we asked 4,000 respondents. So that's 4,000 Ukrainian voices from the Donbas in both parts of the line. We had Levada, who is based in Moscow, ask 1,000, take 1,000 surveys in the government or the non-government controlled, in other words, the Russia-aligned part of the Donbas. We had our research, which is Ukrainian-based company. It's actually headquartered in London. They did 1,000 in the government-controlled areas. And then the key survey company here is KIS, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology that we've worked with for a number of years. And they did surveys on both sides, 1,000 in each places, which means that there was surveyors with a Kiev-based area code calling into non-governmental controlled parts of the Donbas and asking people's opinions. So that's really, really, really key here and really important. What are the results? Well, the results show that in the government-controlled areas of the Donbas, and there you have, so the government-controlled areas are the blue, it's KIS, GCA, and R research. So the government-controlled areas are blue and orange. So look at the blue and orange to find out who they see as responsible for the conflict. What's important here is that this is sort of surprising, is that in the government controlled areas, there's quite a bit of support for placing blame equally on Ukraine and on Russia. There's also quite a bit of support for blaming the Ukrainian government and the West. Then if you look at the findings from Levada, which are in gray here, and so that's the company that's calling in from Moscow. The findings here are what you would expect. People are saying the Ukrainian government, the West, is responsible for the conflict there. This is very, very interesting. What should be the status of the territories uncontrolled by Kiev? So this is really, really where we see it makes a difference where you call from. And in the case of Levada marketing, the overwhelmingly 70+ of respondents say that the Donbas, that's Russian-controlled LNR, DNR areas, should be part of Russia. There's very little support for independence. So what has actually happened, or what happened about a week ago, which is Vladimir Putin recognizing the independence of these particular entities, there's no popular support for that. And there's not even popular support for that amongst the leadership. They want to be part of Russia. And that's actually in keeping with findings in other de facto states, with one exception, and that is ethnic Abkhaz in Abkhazia that we have done over the last decade or so. The findings in terms of KIS in the non-government controlled areas, in other words, the occupied territories, there they find 40% of respondents say that they want their territory to be part of Ukraine. So that's something we can come back to. I think it's a kind of fascinating finding and an important one going forward. There is, surveyors talk about social desirability bias. In this case, there's political desirability bias. What we wanted to underscore, though, more than any of these findings, and what we published on first in the Washington Post, was the results to a question which we call the Victoria question. And it essentially comes from a line from a young Ukrainian woman in Sloviansk who spoke to a British journalist. And she said, it doesn't matter to me whether I live in Ukraine or Russia. All I want is a good salary. And, she was 27 years of age. We modified this question and we said, all I want is a good salary and then a good pension. And so we asked that question. It's, on one sense, it's a perfect examination of the degree to which people are moved by the flag as opposed to moved by public good provision. There's the capacity of the state to deliver for them in their lives. And what you find is that they strongly agree on both sides. That is the dominant sentiment. Now, it's not completely dominant, but as you can see here, it's really quite significant and quite important. Bottom line here, economic conditions and the collapse of the economy there, already suffering from the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then collapsed even further by war, is the dominant economic factor shaping people's lives there. Now, let me talk a little bit about a very, very sensitive issue, which is Ukrainian national identity. And I'll just give you a little vignette of the last time I was in Ukraine, which was in 2019 during Victory Day in May. And there was a large turnout for the celebration of Victory Day. So this is in early May. And here you see the Immortal Regiment. Now, this is a particular non-governmental organization that was effectively captured by the Kremlin in Russia, but operates also across post-Soviet space. And it is where people, relatives come out with photographs of their relatives who fought in the Great Patriotic War. And so this is a very sort of emotive commemoration of an important, hugely important geopolitical event. And so I was, along with my colleagues, able to witness this. And it's a very moving event with, you know, there are still some veterans alive and they're very, very old, but they're there. And so this is, you can just imagine a similar event in the United States and the honoring of veterans, the importance of that. But I want you to draw your attention to the group that is over, it is on my right here with the particular banner. And they are Ukrainian nationalists. And they are shouting at the crowd about the people that they believe are the true Ukrainian heroes. And those are the Ukrainian nationalists that fought against the Soviet Union. And then they sort of have a pantheon here of those fighters with modern fighters who fought in 2014. Now, that there's the right sector. It is far-right organization in Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily represent all of Ukraine and what Ukraine is, but it is an example of what we are dealing with here, which is a very contested field of memory. And I'm bringing that out because I think this is part of explaining who Vladimir Putin is and his particular sensibility. And this sensibility is to absolutely be horrified and condemn those people who are hectoring veterans of the Great Patriotic War. Now, that's one example of a very larger kind of question concerning Ukrainian identity. The geostrategic conflict. We, in 2019, did surveys overall within Ukraine, asking about, instead of making it sort of binary, do you want to join NATO or not join NATO? And we asked, of course, lots of other questions, because in and of itself, that may not be the most relevant question for people in their particular lives. But the results, what we sought to do was to sort of create a gradation. And we asked people, we ended up just with sort of 3 steps in this. And it is trying to measure comfortable or intimacy. So how close do they want to be with Russia? How close do they want to be with NATO? So we give people 3 choices. Do you want good and positive relations with Russia? Do you want good and positive relations with NATO? And these are then the second, do you want military cooperation with? And then would you allow Russian troops and bases in your country? So we asked all of these questions, and these are the particular results of this. Now, you can see in both cases, there's a strong rejection of bases, NATO troops and bases, particularly strong when it comes to Russia. But you can also see that there's a strong desire for good and positive relations with Russia, 60% of the population. Now, when you break this down by macro region, you get results that if you are a Ukrainian a specialist, you will not be surprised by these results at all. And that is that there's a strong geographic dimension to this. Areas in the south and the east of Ukraine generally want closer relations with Russia, and they're more skeptical of relations with NATO. Those are the kind of findings from NATO, and we can go back to that. So that brings me to the second contention that I want to offer, which is the theory of the crisis. So Putin loses patience with Zelensky and plans a war to liberate Ukraine. And so here, what I want to kind of break it down in rather simplistic terms, but there's, I think, three working theories of Russia's influence over Ukraine. The first, which was dominant for a long time, is that Russia would seek to control Ukraine by tilting the Ukrainian political field, by intervening in a way that backs pro-Russian candidates. So backing Yanukovych, for example, in 2004, and then his rebound in 2010. And so that's theory number one. That comes apart with Euromaidan. It comes apart, and Putin takes a decision which is fundamental in 2014, which is to seize Crimea. And as a consequence of doing that, he essentially took Crimea and lost Ukraine, because he took out of the Ukrainian political field a strong bastion of support for pro-Russian candidates. And then he further compounded the problem by doing the same in the Donbas. As a consequence, Russia was forced into a second theory of how it was going to influence Ukraine. And that was to use the territorial conflict that it created in the Donbas as a territorial lever over Ukraine. And the mechanism for that was the Minsk process. And as Russia saw it, the Minsk process was a way in which the Donbas could have a veto over the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine. Well, this was signed under duress by Ukraine, facing already having part of its army destroyed and facing the prospect of further war. It was a dictated peace, a peace at gunpoint. It was extremely unpopular within Ukraine. And what has essentially happened is that that particular theory of Russia's influence over Ukraine through the Minsk process has been has also failed because Ukraine did not implement the Minsk process. And as a consequence, Putin has moved to this third theory, which is what we're seeing on our screens right now, to impose a new order on Ukraine, to potentially establish Novorossiya again, to create a partitioned satellite state, to defeat and to neutralize the country. All of these are increasingly, in my eyes, increasingly desperate measures that he has taken. The history of the lost opening for the Minsk settlement is important, where Zielinski, as a new candidate against Poroshenko, promises to end the war in the Donbas. He's elected with a huge mandate in April of 2019, 73% of the vote. He's inaugurated, he begins talks with Putin, he announces an initial deal with the separatists, and he comes under heavy criticism, and he is threatened with a third Maidan. And, he had a choice then. Force this through, unpopular though it is, or revert back to kind of the position of Poroshenko, a hardline hawkish position, and then later called for admission to NATO and to the European Union. And that's what he does. And as a consequence, Putin then sort of gives up on the Minsk process and moves towards war. Why now? Why are we getting it now? Well, I think the Minsk process, the Minsk Accords, their failure is one reason. I think we've heard the rhetoric, and I am of the school that we have to take very, very seriously what a particular state is saying. That's data. I don't think we should be recoding it by, as Michael McFall and some others are doing, by saying it's not really about NATO. It is about NATO if the particular state is constantly going on about NATO. And NATO becomes an emotional fact of this crisis. It's an important grievance, and therefore we need to understand the motivations of the particular antagonist. There are other factors, so the NATOization of Ukraine, perhaps seeing a favorable strategic landscape, an information echo chamber, I think, is really, really crucial. And COVID is part of this issue, and the sort of paranoia that we see on our screens of that Putin has adopted with COVID isolation. There is a very nice essay in Foreign Affairs with a brilliant title, "Bully in the Bubble," not so long ago, that goes into this particular issue. And then there's important factors that have to do with Putin's personality that I think we also need to engage when we're trying to explain it. Okay, I've talked for quite a while. I have other things that I could say. Let me just end with the idea that Putin then give us his Ukraine rescue fantasy. And it comprised three things. First of all, that there is Ukraine is sort of an artificial country, and this is where the colonialism comes out, where the imperialism comes out. It is historically Russian. Ukrainians are not a real nation. What's interesting about this rhetoric is that it is really critical of the Bolsheviks, so it's anti-Soviet in many ways. But then the second form of justification, the emphasis on denazification, is, of course, you know, it reaffirms the idea of the Great Patriotic War. So it's pro-Soviet. Russia as an anti-fascist power, and kind of embracing the language of genocide and sort of Holocaust memory, which was, and Marlene Laurel has pointed this out, which was never really part of Russian memory. War memory is now increasingly part of it. And then the third aspect, the responsibility to protect script, which they use, and I can talk more about. But I have talked for I believe 40 minutes, so why don't I stop there and take questions that folks may have.
I'm having trouble opening my camera. Maybe Kelly, can you open my camera?
1 second.
Can people hear me? Gerard, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, let me just say, for some reason, Kelly, my camera, it's blocked. It's telling me that you've turned me off. In any case, let me ask a first question that's coming in right away, which picks up on something you just recently mentioned, Gerard. Linda Caputo would like to know, why did Zelensky refuse to implement the Minsk Accords? And maybe with that, you could elaborate a little more on the relationship between right sector and Svoboda and the Zelensky government. It seems to me that those are very small slivers of Ukrainian parliamentary life, but maybe they play outsized roles in people's images, much the way Proud Boys may play in images of the right in the United States.
Yeah, I think that is, yeah, it's, you know, the right is increasingly powerful in the United States. And so the analogy may actually not be a bad one at all, Richard. So there's two ways of reading why Zielinski didn't do it. The first one is the sort of very much an empathetic stretch to him, which is this was an extremely unpopular measure. This was a gunpoint peace. This was a giving to a Russian-supported, stood up proxy actors a veto over the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine, and that was unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable. Why can a small group that are effectively actors for another state have a veto over the sovereign right of a country to choose its own military alliances, to choose its own future? And so, I mean, in that sense, it is perfectly reasonable that he took the policies that he did. So a more arch reading of it would argue that this is the power of the nationalist patriotic forces within Ukraine. While they are not necessarily powerful in the parliament, they're very powerful on the street, and they are mobilized, and they're willing to use violence, and they have used violence in the past, and therefore there's a sort of a degree of intimidation associated with that. So that's a more critical reading. We have to be aware that that is also a storyline which is weaponized by the Russians. And to say that Ukrainian nationalism, I mean, the rhetoric of Putin is that there's all of Ukrainian nationalism is fascist, and therefore it is to be expunged. We need denazification. Now that is, that's part of the imperialism that's at work here. It is a very kind of Soviet style vision that does not allow Ukraine to exist as a nation with the right for its own self-determination, and does not allow it with its heterogeneity. And it has a heterogeneity which is not allowed. Now, that rhetoric reminds me of Milosevic, because in studying Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia for my book on Bosnia, he said the same thing about Tudjman and about Croatian nationalism. Croatian nationalism is fascist. So therefore we have to do the empirical work of saying, actually, the Ustaše regime and Ukrainian nationalism is something that we have to separate out, but there is a strain within within Croatian nationalism, which is fascist. And you still have celebration of that by some far-right forces. But you also have left-wing forms of Croatian nationalism. You have social democratic traditions. You have other traditions. You have a flowering of cultural life and a sort of openness to Europe, and you have LGBTQ communities within Ukraine that are fighting for Ukraine, and fighting, it has to be said, right next to far-right fighters at the moment, because they are united by one thing, which is to seek to fight against those that want to extinguish the Ukrainian nation.
Let me just follow up briefly. Linda has asked a second question, which is, how much credence should we give, if any, that Ukrainian troops in the Donbas, controlled by the government in Kyiv, want to get rid of ethnic Russians? Is this sort of, is there any real threat of ethnic cleansing in the Donbas conducted by Ukraine? Okay, so again, we have to do the work of empirically sorting out a particular storyline, an emotive storyline from fact from that particular emotional charge. So there is a part of Ukrainian nationalism that is very hostile to those that they see as traitors. And so they see those that defected
from the Ukrainian nation in 2014 in Crimea and in the Donbas. And, you know, there was actually not, the actual government structures didn't really defect. It was others that defected. They're hostile to those people. And as any nation would be hostile to people it considers traitors. Now, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are in the Ukrainian army. Now, do they suffer discrimination? Well, when we looked at the particular surveys, overwhelmingly, they were supportive of Ukraine. And I think they probably will be, especially after this particular this survey. But you know, if you wanted to predict who is going to be more sympathetic to Russia, you would look not so much at Russian speaking, you'd look at those who self-declare as ethnic Russians.
We have a couple of questions I'm going to put together. One is from Ward Cornett, who's wondering if you could say more about John Mearsheimer's argument, because it's been seen in the United States quite a bit, which blames much of this and the 2014 problem on the West. And why don't I just stop with that? What do you think about, you said you don't buy into, I guess this was your realist number 2 theory.
Yeah. Yeah, no, generally, I haven't seen his latest versions of these. I mean, frankly, I am sympathetic to the arguments that the West made bad decisions on Ukraine, and I think the Bucharest Declaration is a bad decision. I think that there are risks in the current moment where you have massive support for Ukraine, and that therefore leading to the potential of turning Ukraine into Afghanistan, which I think is just a horrific possibility. That also runs the risk of reaffirming the fact that Russia sees itself as fighting a great patriotic war again, because the Germans are providing weapons to Ukrainian nationalists, and they're fighting like Banderovsky and so on and so forth. And therefore, that is, I think, something that is very, very dangerous. But I also think that his argument is sort of overstated. And so to say the West is to blame misses the co-created nature of this particular crisis. I don't think it was inevitable that Russia had to act the way that it did. I think this is something that is down to the nature of the regime there. But you know, the question concerning timing, in looking at his you know, analysis, there's not enough Ukraine there. There's not enough sort of depth of understanding of the different levels of the crisis. And so, as a geographer, I just think this is, you know, this is the difference between geographers and political scientists. There's the political scientists are going for parsimony, and we're going for like depth. And so in the book, as you well know, I talk about thin and thick geopolitics. And so the thick geopolitics is to really look at these different scales and the different actors in the different scales, and entrepreneurship, and how, you know, there's a sort of contingency to a lot of these events. So there's no inevitability, and so what it means, for example, for a state to control its security environment, which is sort of the standard argument of realists, well, that's an interpretive question. And you can make an argument that from a purely realist point of view, Vladimir Putin's actions have been disastrous. Mersheimer describes him as a first-class strategist, and you can make the argument that this is like third, fourth, fifth. This is at the bottom of the class in terms of strategy, because you take a particular country that was predisposed towards you, and you have alienated. You have brought about your worst nightmare. So I just don't buy that kind of argument at all.
We have questions. I'm going to stay with a few more questions about the local scene in Ukraine and what's likely to transpire, then go back out to more geostrategic things. One question asks whether the internationalization of the crisis, encouraging foreign fighters to travel to Ukraine, then asks, will this become a new Syria? Do you see this becoming either Syria or maybe in the old days, the Spanish Civil War, something like that?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question to ask. I think it's a real danger in the current moment. I would welcome a debate on this particular question. It has always struck me as foolhardy that the West would provide so many arms to Ukraine. Now I understand why that is important, but yet I also think it's a short-sighted policy, in as much as there are many different ways to defeat an occupation. One of them is this sort of blaze of glory style, which is full of sort of military romanticism about going out with AK-47s and taking on tanks. That does not seem to me to be wise, but it does seem as if it would be much better if you train a population in non-violent, non-cooperation with any kind of occupation. And then you make it socially unacceptable to collaborate with an occupying power. And then you engage in persuasion, one-on-one persuasion with the soldier, saying, why are you here? That those kind of conversations rather than bullets are the ways to address that. But, you know, I can say that as an academic. You know, I'm not there in the context, and I'm not going to second guess people who are defending their homes and who feel that this is what they need to do. I just will leave that to others.
My colleague Jean Mueller is wondering if you know if prior to, I guess, 7 or 8 days ago, when the United States and or NATO more broadly and Russia were negotiating, whether anything like the Austrian state treaty for neutrality was discussed, or just was there ever any real chance of negotiating a neutral Ukraine, or is that a non-starter in Ukraine as well as in Russia, frankly?
Yeah, so I think that, well, first of all, hi to John, who will remember the last time I was in Ohio State when I was talking about Bosnia, and he asked me a really great question about casualty numbers. I don't know is the short answer. The idea of a neutral Ukraine is one that makes a lot of sense to outsiders, and Finlandization is also a term that is used. But from a Ukrainian point of view, there's a strong set of arguments against that. And they go along the lines of, well, Ukraine was a neutral country in 2014 when it was attacked, although that particular argument is not that persuasive, because you could see that the folks that were coming in were likely to threaten the lease that Russia had in Crimea for the Black Sea, and so there was a kind of a genuine concern on the part of the Russian Navy about Sevastopol and what was going to happen in 2014. But so that's one particular argument. The other argument is that Russia will never leave us alone. This is a colonial situation. The only Ukraine that it wants is a Ukraine that is subordinate, that a Ukraine that is completely under our thumb. And, you know, so that's part of the discourse, right? That's part of what we have to analyze. I think that when we write the history of this, we will, and this is a conjunctural history, there will be certain moments where the Minsk process and what happened with the Minsk process will be seen as a road not taken. This was a very difficult piece for Ukraine to accept, but if Ukraine had have accepted it, it could have begun to, well, to gain a form of territorial integrity and build from there. You sort of build with an imperfect settlement and then seek to have an economic relationship with the European Union and to not have a geostrategic relationship with NATO. This is something that is going to, be a subject of, I'm sure, books in the future. But I do think there were certain paths that were missed. Now, Sam Sharap, who is at RAND, made this kind of important argument in a Financial Times op-ed about the fact that there should be an offer declaration on the part of NATO saying we have no plans currently to admit Ukraine into NATO. And that should be a kind of a formal declaration. So you don't sort of repudiate the Bucharest memorandum. What you say is that you create a new statement, which therefore allows for a face-saving response. Apparently that was offered to Putin by Macron, and it was turned down, which indicates that there was a certain desire for a confrontation and for a violent reimposition of Russian rule over Ukraine. I'm not hearing you, Richard.
I have a couple of questions about how this might expand and how, if it did, that would affect your theories. One of them is if Russia from this would expand this and begin a war in any of the Baltic states, or perhaps in Transnistria, using that as a device or as a launching pad in Moldova, and springboard from Transnistria to taking over all of Moldova. What do you think the prospects are that Russia will expand into these other areas? And if it did, how would that affect the argument you've been making to this point?
So I think that this is, like I said, a strategic blunder on the part of the Russian military. I mean, I have studied surveys from 2014, particularly one in March of 2014, which I discuss in the book, and then we conducted our own in the end of 2014. There was very little appetite for support for Russian intervention in a so-called Novorossiya. It was a small sliver, small minority that supported that. So there's no appetite for Russian control over parts of Ukraine today, with perhaps the exception, slight exception of the government-controlled areas of the Donbas. But I would have to look at that in more detail. There's certainly ambivalent feelings in that area about Kiev and what Kiev has done to them. But what that means, therefore, is that Russia has a full-time job just trying to control Ukraine. I don't think it's going to be able to do it. I think it is failing. I think there's very little legitimacy. There's next to no legitimacy. Its war story of genocide in the Donbas and the like, which is playing on Russian TV, has no kind of cut, no anchor of support within Ukraine itself. I think Ukraine is more united now. We see it. I mean, there's a sort of a popular coalescence around the idea that Ukraine should be free in the sense to have its own self-determination, which means that therefore Russia's stretching beyond Odessa to go into Transnistria that's imperial overstretch. Therefore, I don't think they're going to be able to do it. I think that they have a major legitimacy crisis on their hands, the degree to which they're going to be able to sustain this informational bubble that they have created, the regime has created, the degree to which they're going to be able to sustain that in order to have support from the Russian people is really fundamentally under question. So, of course, there is the possibility of escalation because they're desperate, so therefore they're gambling. But this is, in one sense, what NATO needs to do is sort of stay calm with this crisis and be confident about the fact that this is a mistake, and just be very, very clear about having clear lines between, in terms of its support for Ukraine. And, of course, those lines, the degree to which those are respected and the degree to which Russia is willing to put up with a situation where effectively NATO countries are supplying an insurgency that's killing Russians, the degree to which that is going to be tolerated by Russia if it doubles down is a big, big question. It's a big question. And that's why I am less big on the supplying arms and more on the other forms of aid in order to help people deal with occupation and get through this, and then also help all of those people that are displaced.
Getting quite a few questions about nuclear weapons and whether you think that there's a prospect they would be used, how dangerous or how much more dangerous has this made the world in terms of nuclear confrontation?
Yeah, so I'm very concerned about that, this has been a very, very trying crisis, and the real concern I have is that Putin feels he's losing, and therefore he will escalate in order to try to get out of the particular situation. And of course, nuclear weapons are one of the instruments that he has at his disposal. It is sort of crossing a line that we hope no leader would ever cross. But we've, with Vladimir Putin, he's crossed a line here where you essentially have the invasion of a sovereign state by another state in a very blatant manner with no justification, with no persuasive pretext, one that has no sort of emotional event which was a trigger. This was sort of, I wrote an op-ed in the Irish Times about this. This was done in cold anger. And so therefore, it is one of those things that I'm very concerned about. And so I hope that the Biden administration has a line of communication with the Russian state and with the Russian generals, and that they are very, very clear about the fact that there are certain things that they're not going to do, and that they also restrain Poland and the Baltic states so that they don't get out ahead of themselves in terms of their rhetoric and their particular actions. There's also the danger of inadvertent crash and the like. And, NATO was flying strategic bombers in Ukraine. It was certainly pushing the envelope, and it's doing everything it can short of putting boots on the ground to help the Ukrainians. And so that's a situation that is, it's dangerous. It's just plain dangerous.
People are interested in what you think various solutions might be. I don't think any of them personally are available in the very short run. Hal Arkey's, my colleague in psychology, is asking whether a partitioned Ukraine would be an option in the future, and whether if you see that as either credible or desirable. Someone else is asking whether you see a neutral Ukraine as a desirable and feasible outcome. I guess that they're just looking for how you think this might resolve itself.
So let me, I'm going to show, I had a series of other slides. So how the war may end slide. So this is various scenarios. The first is where we are right now, is sort of a quagmire, and this becomes Russia's Afghanistan again. Then the second option is regime change and partition of the country, in which you have former Galicia, West Ukraine, partitioned, separated out, and then you have occupation of the country. The third scenario, which is, of course, it's entangled with all of these, is that NATO, as this goes on, gets further drawn into the crisis. The fourth one is that this, essentially NATO has chosen, or the NATO states, the West has chosen to collapse the economy of Russia. And that has the potential to cause chaos. And so and this is a part of the dangerous nature of the crisis, in one sense, the West is betting on regime change in Russia. And that is, extremely dangerous, because all of the people around Putin owe their careers to Putin. So the one thing that you would want is defection within that ruling elite. But any kind of defection throws into question all of the power structure, the power vertical that's been created there over 20 years. And so the prospect of that, I think, is very, very low. But if there is chaos on the streets, if people feel that they have to go out and protest because their livelihoods are at stake, if Russia is becoming an Iran or a North Korea, then this is a very unstable situation. And so I think that we're just in a moment where the question of the neutrality of Ukraine is not the major issue. I try to have some discussion of the implications. As destabilized partition Ukraine, a divided European continent, resurgent militarism across the continent. And I think one of the implications of this is that there's going to be a far right dimension of this as those fighters go into Ukraine and then potentially come back to the rest of Europe. So therefore, is this a Syria? And therefore, does this have implications for the stability of Poland and other countries? If there is a resurgent culture of militarism and then also an uncivil society, the dark destabilized Russia, and then the last one, which is not front and center for people talking, but one that I have been focused on over the last 2 or 3 years, which is climate change. I don't know if people paid any attention to the fact that there was a climate report that came out this last week that said that things are even worse than we had anticipated, and so we are barreling towards a hothouse Earth. And in one sense, our preoccupation with old-style geopolitical questions is completely getting in the way of all of this energy transition that needs to happen if we're going to have any chance to reduce greenhouse gases and to arrest this scenario of a hothouse Earth.
I have a bunch of questions about Putin, but I'm going to use what you just answered as a segue to a kind of one-off question. Matt Coleman, one of my colleagues here in Ohio State's Geography Department, has a number of his class member people in the rooms. And one asked this. I was wondering how, being a political geographer at Ohio State, when looking at the complexity, how important it is to understand the role of the everyday and multiple forms of resistance that take place in such conflicts. How has the conflict problematized traditional understandings of geopolitics moving forward? I realize this is kind of an academic question, but as you mentioned just a minute ago, your climate change issue is being pushed off the agenda. I'm just curious, this I know is a very academic question. Some of our audience won't be interested in the question, but I think we have a class here of geographers that will be very interested in it.
Sure. So in one sense, this is a war which is driven by very much an old style conception of geopolitics as territorial spheres of influence, that there's this notion that you look at the map and you can see where the areas that you control, and therefore that gives you some sense of security. So there's this idea that you have a buffer, and that's physical geography, terrain in between your location and the location of your enemy makes a difference. And it's really quite puzzling to people in the era of hypersonic missiles why that is the case. But that rhetoric is still very, very important. And the missile issue, it gets down to time-space compression. You know, Putin talked about missiles which are 5 minutes from Moscow, you know, as opposed to 7 or 8 minutes if they're from Western Ukraine. It's sort of a somewhat absurd, but that's nevertheless something that mobilizes people and mobilizes militaries, and they have the maps on the wall as to where the territory is that they control. That sort of misses the larger context. And this is, if you go back to the classic geopoliticians of Halford McKenders and others, they talk about how physical geography, the Earth as a whole, the Earth system, is the arena within which geopolitics occurs. And what is their notion is that that arena is fairly stable. It's the sort of stage upon which great powers play out their games across the map. What has happened with climate change is that that particular stage is now shaking. It is an agent in and of itself. So the everyday that Matt is talking about, the everyday involves the fact that people are, let's say, dealing with ecological systems that are changing, with you know, for example, flooding, with crop failure or crop stress, with an environment that is no longer familiar, and there's a sort of a dislocation from where it is you previously lived. And you kind of the sense of the everyday and the sense of memories in a particular place where, you know, for example, you had snow every winter and you had these sort of routines. If that is changing under climate change, and it is, therefore we're in a sort of a world which is increasingly disoriented. And so that sense of the geophysical and the biogeophysical, because, you know, the plants that we have, the animals, the non-human, all of those are affected and changed by this. So, you know, there's a whole climate dimension to the crisis in Ukraine that I think deserves exploration. It's not simply the oil and gas. It's the Donbas, which is historically was an area of massive coal mining. It is the nuclear power plants, the Chernobyl, all of these things are themes that I think could be explored by geographers, and bringing out that sort of richness and challenging always this chessboard conception of geopolitics.
We're close to time, but I have quite a few questions about Vladimir Putin. Some wonder whether he's stable psychologically or whether he's becoming unhinged. Some wonder just how much he is responsible for this, and if he left the scene, would it end? And then others are asking about what's the prospect of him being removed from the scene, either by generals within Russia or some other, or over time, given the economic sanctions and the bite. And I'm confident on March 24th, to put a plug in here now, we're going to return to all these themes with Professor Timothy Fry. But I'm going to pitch these questions to you just now, Gerard, and see what your take is on Putin.
Yeah, so Tim Fry is much better positioned than I to answer those questions. I look to people like Marlene Laurel at George Washington, to Tim, to Brian Taylor at Syracuse, to Fiona Hill here for my Putinology, and Sam Green also in London. My sense is that he is angry in a way that we haven't seen. There's a degree of disgust. This is in that op-ed that I wrote for the Irish Times, I talked about the fact that there's a cheap theory of Putin, which is that he's simply mad and the like. And I think we have to dismiss that, but we have to talk about emotional rationality. That that, for example, the particular crisis, the war speech, after sort of perfunctory remarks about the Donbas, goes into a long series of resentments about NATO and NATO expansion. So that's an emotional fact of the crisis that's really front and center for him. Then Ukraine, and as a Soviet man, and as someone who lost a brother during World War, the Great Patriotic War, lost a brother that he never knew in Leningrad, the idea that you would have dishonoring or challenging of the Great Patriotic War narrative is abhorrent to him and disgusting to him. He sees himself as a Nazi hunter, as someone who takes the Holocaust very, very seriously. But of course, they just bombed Kiev, the mother of all European cities, and one of the bombs landed near Baba Yar. So this is the sort of self-constructed world that he has, but it is another emotional fact. And then thirdly, the whole issue of genocide and the Donbas. I think we need to take those seriously. I don't think that he is unstable, but I do think that he has changed, and isolation as a consequence of COVID is one factor. But he has surrounded by a series of sycophants, and they're not the A-team for Russia in terms of understanding the world and understanding the geostrategic landscape. These are old men that the world is passing them by, and there's lots of things that they don't understand, but they've got enormous amount of power.
There's a set of questions that ask about how you think President Biden has handled this, whether you can compare him to Donald Trump and Barack Obama's handling of these issues prior. I realize that's a gigantic question, but if you wanted to express your opinion, I'll give you your chance here in the last minute or two.
Yeah, I have a generally positive attitude towards President Biden and how he's handled it. I am critical of some things for sure, and one is where he said that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. I think that was a very dangerous speech act, because in effect, if he believes that, then he thinks that they're coming for the Baltic states, and therefore that means war. That NATO is going to have to trigger Article 5. So he you know, he is also, speaking of old men, I mean, he is also an old leader, and therefore is projecting projecting an image of the United States which is not as strong as some would like. Now, let me qualify that by saying, I think in his judgments, he's generally been spot on. He has done a significant work in rallying support and creating unity within NATO. So I overall do not have too much difficulty with supporting him. I am concerned that he is potentially not going to be sufficiently strong on the need for limits. I would have preferred that the United States would have said, yes, we're going to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot join NATO. We're going to accept the fact that Bucharest, that the open door should be shut, and that we're going to prioritize arms control first and front and center. But, you know, there are lots of reasons why he didn't do that. You know, there are people in the Biden administration that are sort of hardline Atlanticists to the max folks, and then there are other folks that like the CIA director, that are very, very experienced Russia hands and know the situation intimately, and have, in my opinion, pretty good judgment.
In a much earlier part of my life, I worked for Bill Burns at the State Department, so I share your regard for his judgment and acumen on this.
Yeah.
I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's just been a terrific hour and a half, a true tour de force, just what I was hoping for being able to bring to the audience here at Mershon. So thank you very much. I want to remind our audience that there's a lot of questions I didn't get to. This issue is not going to be resolved in the short run. On Friday at noon, I'm hosting an open forum for the Mershon Center's First Fridays, where, as I mentioned at the outset, Dr. Scott Smitson will be joining me. He's a professor at the Joint Operations University and a former advisor to the now Secretary of Defense. And then on March 24th, I'll be hosting Timothy Fry, a professor at Columbia University, who's written a very insightful book, in my view, on Putin and power and institutions in Russia. And on April 8th, we'll have a conference on the US and NATO and relations with Russia. Marlene Laurel, who Gerard mentioned several times, will be part of that conference. So I encourage you to go to mershoncenter.osu.edu to find more details on all of these events and register if you'd like. Once again, Gerard, thank you so much. It's been a terrific talk, and it's been wonderful for you to help us out to understand more about Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sure I got some things wrong, so please feel free to email me and let me know what I got wrong, and I'd welcome further discussion. So thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you. For everyone here at Mershon, we want to say goodbye and hope to see you on Friday at noon or on the 24th.